Over the summer, I performed a stand-up set at an open mic in Hollywood.
I recently hooked up with this tall, broad, blonde, Brazilian.
It was pretty
man.
explicit.
It was like my ass was one big acai bowl. And he was just enjoying all of its antioxidants.
At first glance, my jokes seemed very crass, perhaps even cheap, but I would describe this set as an unapologetic expression of my sexuality, my homosexuality, as well as my sensuality.
So I'm gay, what?
And subsequently, it is a resistance to the misconceptions and stereotypes of LGBTQ+ people. These misconceptions derive from the lack of open discussion of LGBTQ+ sex outside of LGBTQ+ media. It was important to redefine gay identity using comedy so as to relate to an audience who lack exposure to LGBTQ+ people. To do so, I used situational irony, contrast, and understatement to clarify some common misconceptions of gay male identities, like the conflation of gender, biological sex, and sexuality, and the false dichotomy between religion and sexuality. In the first beat, I describe a sexual encounter during which my partner uses gender-specific vocabulary that actually does not apply to my gender identity.
Yeah. I love your pussy. What?
In order to highlight the awkwardness I felt after hearing this from my then partner, I contrast it with the common noises often heard throughout sex. It's a broad range.
My go-to is, or.
The conflation of gender identity and sexuality derives from the appropriation of female-gendered nouns in queer slang.
Yes, bitch, yes!
Since my then partner uses it in an incorrect way, I describe in painful detail my internal monologue that followed. My use of understatement and dialogue for this section of my set was critical to highlight my frustration with my then partner for a predominantly cis-hetero audience.
Wait a second. I had half a mind to tell him to leave, you know? But that would have been really weird because I was at his apartment. I might have birthing hips, but you can't confuse that for clitoris, okay?
Confusing birthing hips for a clitoris understates the higher-level misconception of gender identity, and in doing so, contrasts the pretty personal, significant mishap of misgendering genitalia. As a result, the emotional dimensions of the anecdote are made relatable and funny for a cis-hetero audience who wouldn't directly empathize with misunderstandings of sex, gender, and sexuality, but would understand getting generally mistaken for something you are not. In the second beat, I describe my Catholic confession with a priest in Hong Kong.
Right before I came to the States, I did confession. Yeah. You know the Catholic sacrament where you have to confess your sins before a priest?
Again, I opt for the explicit, the faux pas over the implicit, to convey a very real situational irony specific to gay people who also identify as religious. The weighted significance of sexual deviance, despite the plethora of sins for which people could similarly be persecuted.
Priest about pretty much everything. I told him about the casual sex. I told him about the drugs. I told him about missing church on Sundays because that's equivalent. I just didn't mention that I was gay because it was 2017 and Pope Francis is a cool pope and not just a regular pope.
I reference Mean Girls to establish context for the joke at two levels. First, that superficially, faith is not mutually exclusive with homosexuality under the current Catholic Pope Francis, but imitating an iconic scene from Mean Girls is meant to highlight the misalignment of Pope Francis's self-perception of Catholic ideology and its practice. Just because Regina's mom calls herself a cool mom doesn't mean she is. Similarly, just because a prominent Catholic authority figure embraces homosexuality doesn't mean the constituents of the Catholic institution embraces homosexuality as well. The reference was critical to make this common misconception obvious to a cis-hetero audience. I illustrate this dissonance between idealism and reality through loaded questions that mimic a facade of open-mindedness. Since loaded questions aren't really open questions, they characterize the priest as ignorant and rude.
Once he found out that I was gay, he says, "You do realize that loving men is a sin." I'm like, what?
Then I contrast these philosophical-seeming religious justifications with blunt language and repetitive syntax, whose explicit language, despite being rude in other contexts, is not really rude compared to the priest's ignorance.
Priest, I feel like you're losing focus here. I just told you that I have very casual sex. I do not call these men. I do not know their last names.
The priest's comments sound increasingly archaic so as to paint his point of view as anachronistic.
And then he's like, homosexuality is forbidden.
The use of dialogue contrasting the priest's authoritative comments with my skeptical yet valid rebuttals still in support of other Catholic conventions, such as abstinence, portrays the priest as arrogant, even within Catholic standards.
Like, I'm talking bathrooms at clubs. I'm talking rooftops. I'm talking public beaches and playgrounds. Are we not gonna... He's like, you must pay for penance after your sodomy. What?
Script on socially inappropriate behavior results in a cognitive dissonance that is frankly humorous. A critical feature of this joke and my set in general is my use of sexually explicit language.
So what did I do? I listened to the other half of my mind that led to an orgasm. Yes!
Which is typically socially inappropriate. The function of the sexually explicit language was to contrast behavior not often deemed socially inappropriate. This might not have been the most appropriate technique to challenge stereotypes concerning gay identity, since hypersexuality and femininity are prevalent stereotypes of gay men. The distinction between unbridled self-identification with characteristics that happen to align with stereotypes and playing stereotypes is a subtle one that might not read for an audience who have not been on the wrong side of stereotypes. Granted, my Southern Californian audience might be open to LGBTQ+ culture, but this cannot compensate for the potential subconscious biases that a stand-up set might reinforce. Comedy is inherently open to interpretation. For example, logical premises are made implicit to make punchlines more effective. The reason why things might be funny will be... The reasons why things might be funny will differ by the individual as a result. The lowbrow, casual nature of stand-up also encourages System 1 thinking, which might reinforce subconscious biases. However, by speaking to personal experiences rather than generalizing my experience, my self-identification with characteristics that align with stereotypes is a form of resistance in itself. It challenges the notion that outgroup peoples are subservient to social norms, such as those imposed by religious institutions. As a gay male, it also challenges the prevalence of heteronormativity in social discourse, a prevalence that enables the conflation of gender identity, biological sex, and sexuality. In their place, it advocates for a self-loving kind of individualism, a kind that doesn't need to play to stereotypes, but is self-consistent and powerful.
Yeah!